This was an example. And I sat next to this woman. When I first joined the Marxist group I was in, I was a college student, I was 19. Somebody in the group who lived in Detroit was driving from Detroit to Buffalo, New York. So they picked me up, and I went in their car, and we drove up to Buffalo, New York. And we went to visit a woman who was in her 80s. We sat down next to this woman who was in her 80s. She got out the photo album. She showed us the pictures from the bad old days, from McCarthyism. You know, she told me, it's gonna be hard for me to not like start crying talking about some of this stuff, but you don't know how amazing these old communists were. Okay? We have all these boomers from the 60s, we have the modern day synthetic left, but these older communists, these greatest generation communists, born in the 1930s, born in the 1920s, these were some really special people. They're all dead now. And you don't know how amazing these human beings were. These were people who believed in communism with all their heart and soul, dedicated their lives to it, and went through hell for their beliefs in communism, and made huge sacrifices, lost jobs, went to prison. You don't know how amazing these people were. And what they were connected to was not the synthetic left. It wasn't a 1960s rock and roll concert doing drugs. These people were connected to a real communist movement. It was tied to the really existing Soviet Union. And I mean, you don't know. It'll be hard for me to not start crying when I talk about this, but I'm going to talk about it. The story, we went to this old woman's house in Buffalo. She got out the photo album. And in the photo album, she showed us pictures. Youngstown, and not Youngstown, but Buffalo's a steel manufacturing town. A lot of steel manufacturing there. And the Steelworkers Union, you have to remember, was started by communists, right? The National Steel Strike was led by William Z. Foster. Gus Hall and William Z. Foster and other Communist Party leaders started the Steelworkers Organizing Committee that eventually created, so it was communists who created the Steelworkers Union, United Steelworkers, USW, that was created by communists. And one thing that happened was in the 1948, the steel company fired every worker who was a member of the Communist Party. Every single worker in the steel mill, there was thousands who worked in the steel mills back then, fired every steel worker who was in the Communist Party. Fired him. So then, the next day, there was a protest outside the steel mill by communists, by civil libertarians, the ACLU, other people, protesting, saying that steel workers have the right to be part of whatever political party they want, Republican, Democrat, Communist, Socialist, whatever. And what happened then was the local FBI came and took a picture of the demonstration, figured out everyone at the demonstration, and printed in the newspaper, in the daily newspaper, printed the names and addresses of every single person at the demonstration. Their name and their address was printed in the Buffalo daily newspaper. This woman that I spoke to talked about how the FBI came to her house. Wanted to talk to her. She was a teacher at the time. They came to her school, and she got fired from being a teacher for being a communist. She got another teaching job. And again, the FBI came to her school. She got fired for being a communist. So then she got a job at a phone company. And when she got the job at the phone company, the FBI showed up. And the phone company said, "You're not going to talk about communism on the phone." The phone company didn't care that she was a communist, so she kept her job. That happened. Another story that I heard from older folks who lived under McCarthyism was that, during the Korean War, when the United States killed millions of people on the Korean Peninsula to try and, destroy the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, there were a few protests against the Korean War. Not many, because of McCarthyism, because the country was in an anti-communist hysteria. But one thing that happened was that in New York City, the Young Communist League, which was an underground illegal organization, organized a group of people to gather in Times Square wearing suits and ties. Just gather, just like anything. And then someone gave the signal. They shouted the code word. And immediately they unfurled a banner that said, U.S. troops out of Korea. And almost immediately, a line of cops came and just started beating them up. And so then they broke apart. They went one square down. They went to Madison Square, 34th Street. And again, all silent, all standing there, wearing their suits and ties, looking like nothing. Someone shouted the code word, and then they unfurled the banner again, U.S. troops out of the Korean Peninsula. And then almost immediately, a row of cops came and started clubbing them and beating them up. So then they went down to Union Square. And again, they did this, and they did this all the way down to Foley Square. And a number of people were beaten up and sent to the hospital. People did prison time for subversive activity. People did prison time. Months in jail for that demonstration because it was promoting communism. It was, again, people think that McCarthyism was just Hollywood. That's what people think. People think McCarthyism was a bunch of Hollywood actors got dragged in front of a committee or something. No, it was a lot more than that. It was a lot more than that. There were a lot of everyday people who really suffered during the McCarthy period. Couldn't work, couldn't get a job. It was an awful, awful moment. And, you get a crazy narrative. So many times I would hear about McCarthyism. I'd be in school and they'd be telling us about McCarthyism. And I would hear this line. And it always annoyed me when I would hear this. It always annoyed me. Is people would start talking about McCarthyism. And they would say, there were some, good people who got in trouble with McCarthyism. I'd be like, excuse me? They'd say, oh, yeah, I heard there was an actor who just, he took communism, he took a Marxist class when he was in college, and he lost his job. Isn't that a shame? Or another thing I would hear is, there was one person who had just for 3 weeks, they'd had a subscription to the Daily Worker, and they could never work in Hollywood again, or they lost their job as a college professor because they, for 3 weeks, had a subscription. Isn't that awful? Well, you're missing the point, okay? You're allowed to be a communist. Right? The United States government says, right, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly. So it's not some good people got hurt. No, you're allowed to be a communist, right? Yes, there were many people who had just some spurious, random relationship and their political enemies used that, against them. But there were a lot of people in McCarthyism who did believe in communism with all their heart and soul. And who did nothing but exercise their freedom of speech and their freedom of assembly and their freedom of association and join the Communist Party of the United States, an organization that did not advocate the violent overthrow of the U.S. government, but instead advocated a peaceful democratic transition to socialism and friendship with the Soviet Union and China and the countries around the world that were struggling for freedom. And there were a lot of people that because of that, had their lives destroyed. There was a concert in upstate New York, Peekskill, New York. There was a concert. The Communist Party had a concert, in a park in this upstate New York town. And a mob of people from the Ku Klux Klan and the American Legion mobilized and attacked the concert. And people lost their eyes. People were injured. McCarthyism was an absolute nightmare. And one thing about McCarthyism, again, that people don't talk about, is one of the main targets was the civil rights movement. The black freedom struggle. Because what did the Communist Party do? They fought for black people's rights. Paul Robeson, probably the most famous African American at the time. He'd been in movies, he'd been on Broadway, he was a musician who was widely loved. Paul Robeson was dragged before the House Un-American Activities Committee. What else? The Civil Rights Congress, which was an organization that fought for black civil rights and against the death penalty and would supply lawyers to free, African Americans who were accused and facing, the Jim Crow courts. They were targeted. They were viciously targeted. When Martin Luther King started his civil rights marches, 1954, you had the Montgomery bus boycott. What did all the news media say? This is a communist conspiracy. The civil rights movement is a communist plot. That was the line, right? You know, you can look at the protests. Look at some of the video, you know, the protests that went on. The right-wingers, listen to them all be interviewed. Race mixing is communism. You know, it was widely known that the communists fought for black people, and so they accused Dr. Martin Luther King of being a communist. He wasn't one. He later, in his final years of his life, he started advocating like social democracy, democratic socialism. But he, you know, he never became a Marxist. He was never a Communist Party member. But that was the target. McCarthyism was very, very awful. It was very, 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 very awful. And, you know, in 1951, again, look this up. If you don't believe me, look this up. In 1951, they passed a law called the Mccarthyism Internal Security Act of 1951. That was a law that said in a time of national emergency, if the government declared a national emergency, there would be a list of 2 million people. 2 million people assembled by the U.S. government, the Justice Department, 2 million people associated with subversive organizations who would be rounded up and placed in concentration camps. They had a law to put people in concentration camps. A U.S. government law, the Mccarthyism Internal Security Act, was passed to put people in concentration camps if they, you know, in a time of national emergency. If you were a Communist Party member, and the Communist Party was never 2 million people, so if you were a Communist Party member or one of the 2 million on that list, in a national emergency, you went to a concentration camp. Now, you know, I mean, no, McCarthyism was very, very, very extreme, and it was very, very awful. You know, no doubt about it. And a lot of people gloss over that. They think it was just Hollywood celebrities who got targeted. They think it was, you know, and the reason it was ended, the reason McCarthyism was ended was because the middle class was using it against the ruling class. Joe McCarthy accused the U.S. Army of being communist. There was a member of the U.S. Senate who committed suicide because he was being blackmailed about the fact that his son had been to a peace meeting or something. And that, you know, that McCarthyism, it really started with the Democrats. It started with Harry Truman and the Democrats purging the Roosevelt wing of the Democratic Party. And in a lot of cases, it's actually pretty wild. It had an ethnic component, right? That in urban centers of the United States, you know, and still to this day, right? In Chicago, Philadelphia, you know, Milwaukee, New York City, you know, a lot of the city government are Roman Catholic, right? That's true. I mean, it's just, you know, a lot of the cops, a lot of the firemen, a lot of the judges are Roman Catholic, and they're Democrats. And the labor unions, you know, the labor unions and the labor movement in the United States, there were a lot of Jewish folks involved in that. And it was kind of a turf war in the Democratic Party, with the Truman wing of the Democratic Party that was very Roman Catholic, purging the Roosevelt wing of the Democratic Party, which was very Jewish. And it was an ethnic conflict in a lot of ways. And you read a lot of the anti-communist rants from the Democrats who were pushing McCarthyism, and there was innuendo about Jews and, you know, stuff like that. In fact, Al Smith, who was the leader of the Democratic Party of New York City, he had denounced Roosevelt as a communist traitor. He'd started the American Liberty League, which was an anti-Roosevelt faction of the Democratic Party, and he was Roman Catholic. And that the Roman Catholic Church in the 50s was in kind of an anti-communist frenzy. And so you had the urban Catholic Democrats purging Jewish folks aligned with the labor movement and with the Roosevelt wing of the Democratic Party, accusing them of being communists. However, after the 1949 revolution in China, after the People's Republic of China was established, at that point, it switched from Democrats, you know, blaming other Democrats. I don't know who that is, Raphael, so I can't talk about it. I don't know who that is. And it turned into the Republicans saying that the Democratic Party was soft on communism. The rallying cry was, "Who lost China?" Who lost China was the rallying cry. They said that the Democrats, Harry Truman and Roosevelt, were Democrats, and they were soft on communism. They lost China. And they went after Alger Hiss. Do folks know the name Alger Hiss? Alger Hiss was a Roosevelt Democrat, basically, who'd been part of starting the United Nations. And they started this whole thing claiming he had been a secret member of the Communist Party, and he had not been. And they started this whole campaign against Alger Hiss, that Alger Hiss was secretly, and Alger Hiss ended up going to prison for perjury. It was a whole wild case. The Republicans were calling the Democrats communists. And then Joe McCarthy emerged among the Republicans. Joe McCarthy emerged among the Republicans as this nut. But Joe McCarthy was a Republican, and he represented like middle-class folks, doctors, lawyers, lower level folks. He wasn't a big money guy. He was in with some lower level capitalists. And he was speaking in West Virginia, and he said, "I have here in my hand a list of 51 employees of the U.S. State Department that are members of the Communist Party." The Communist Party. I mean, Joe McCarthy, he started using the anti-communism against people in his own party and against the U.S. Army and against, and it was almost like, it was like you had to do what he said or else, he would call you a communist. And after Joe McCarthy was basically mobilizing against a lot of the ruling class with this, calling a lot of people in the ruling class, a lot of high-ranking members of Congress, and calling them all communists. And at that point, the mainstream U.S. media, Edward R. Murrow, they turned against Joe McCarthy. But there's another factor in breaking McCarthyism. A couple factors. First was the FBI discovered that it wasn't going to destroy the Communist Party. The FBI noticed that no matter how intense McCarthyism got, no matter how much they made these communists miserable, there was a layer of about 10,000 people who were going to stay in the Communist Party no matter what, right? That William Z. Foster was not going to be broken. Elizabeth Gurley Flynn was not going to be broken. Who else? Eugene Dennis was not going to be broken. Paul Robeson was not going to be broken. And that there was a whole layer of people that, you could make it. A lot of people quit the Communist Party during that time, sure, right? But there was a layer of people in the 1950s that were going to stay in the Communist Party one way or another. So that was the first thing. The second thing was an international factor. Stalin died. Then Khrushchev came to power. Then Khrushchev hinted to the United States that he wanted to negotiate. Khrushchev was saying, look, Stalin, he was this wild anti-imperialist. The last speech Stalin ever gave was a global condemnation of imperialism. It was just amazing. The last speech that Stalin gave is a very powerful speech. But Stalin died, and Khrushchev came into office. And you'll notice that, 1956 in the Soviet Union, you had the Party Congress, right? The 20th Party Congress, where, Khrushchev took a dump all over Stalin. He just gave this big, long anti-Stalin rant. After that, there was a feeling that Khrushchev might want to negotiate. So McCarthyism was broken by those factors. Khrushchev was coming in. He wanted to negotiate with the United States. The FBI discovered they weren't going to really destroy the Communist Party. And thirdly, the McCarthyism was being used by the middle class against the ruling class, right? And the John Birch Society, right? The crazy right-wingers of the early 60s, they were McCarthyists, and they thought the Rockefellers were communists, and they thought that all the major corporations in the USA were communists. There was a lot of weird middle-class libertarian elements that jumped onto McCarthyism to kind of mobilize against the ultra-rich in the United States, right? The Rockefellers, they believe in birth control. Everyone knows birth control is communist. Just, obviously it's not. It's funny, when I was in college, there was a used bookstore, and for like a nickel, I found a copy of a book called None Dare Call It Treason. None Dare Call It Treason. And it was this McCarthyist book. It was a little paperback that listed all kinds of institutions in the United States that it said were communist. The Methodist Church, because the Methodist Church had, opposed fascism. Opposed fascism, supported the Spanish Republic. It's pretty wild. McCarthyism is a definite, and it had an impact. You wouldn't have had the 1960s and the New Left without McCarthyism. And you wouldn't have had the neocons without the 1960s and the New Left. In my book on Kamala Harris, I talk about all of this because there's a continuity to U.S. politics. McCarthyism was a reaction to the Popular Front and Roosevelt. The New Left was a reaction to McCarthyism. The neocons were a reaction to the new left. And we're living now in a period that is very much defined by the failure of the neoconservatives. The neoconservatism was a very effective model for, running the United States. McCarthyism wasn't effective. It ultimately collapsed, right? It led to stuff the ruling class didn't want. The new left was not effective because it ultimately led to, the political upsurge of the 1960s, the Black Panthers, etc. But the neocon model, from about 1972 until about 2006, 2007, the neoconservative model for managing the United States worked out very, very well. The neocon formula, the Cold War normal, the late Cold War normal, was a very effective way for managing U.S. society. It broke with the financial crisis. The Bush administration was the very end of neoconservatism. But that was kind of, the ruling class was figuring out how do we manage the United States, post-World War II. And they first tried McCarthyism. McCarthyism was moving towards some kind of fascism. But that was a disaster. It put a lot of the ruling class in danger. So then they tried the new left. And the new left, it had its results, but ultimately it spun out of their control with Students for a Democratic Society and the Black Panthers and all kinds of rebellions, and that didn't work. So then, neoconservatism worked very, very well, right? Neoconservatism was the model that held the United States together from the, starting in the 70s, early 70s, and the 80s, 90s, 2000s. And then it finally broke, right? And that the ruling class is constantly figuring out how can they stay in power in the United States? How can they keep peace within their own class? How can they beat down countries around the world? How can they keep us rabble in line here in the United States? McCarthyism, the new left, and the neocons and the late Cold War normal are all attempts to do that. And right now, Biden, you can be sure, Biden is trying to develop a new formula. How do we control the rabble? How do we make sure something like Trump doesn't happen again? How do we make sure no real socialism ever comes to, how do we control the rabble? They're trying to figure it out. So there you go. All righty. Enough about that.